I walked in and saw my family on the couch, my wife, mom, sons, and best friend. "What's wrong?" I asked, fearing something bad. "Dad, sit down," my son said. "You need to accept a new reality. You're not in charge of this family anymore. Uncle Peter is more like a father to us now." Anger burned inside me. They all knew. I left the room without a word. The next day, I had 69 missed calls when they realized the revenge I had prepared. I walked in exhausted from the long day, expecting nothing more than a quiet evening. Instead, I was greeted by an eerie silence, one that didn't belong in my home. My mother, my wife, my sons, and my best friend, Peter, all sat on the couch, their faces unreadable, their eyes avoiding mine. The room felt off. Something was wrong. It wasn't the usual tension that sometimes lingered when I got home late. It wasn't the lingering smell of burnt food from Doris's failed attempts at cooking. It wasn't even the way my son sat stiffly as if bracing for impact. No. This was something deeper. Something deliberate. I set my briefcase down, rolling my shoulders as I tried to read the air. "What's wrong?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady. No one spoke immediately. The hesitation sent a ripple of unease down my spine. Then my eldest son, Michael, cleared his throat and said something that I would never forget. "Dad, sit down. You need to accept a new reality. You're not in charge of this family anymore. Uncle Peter is more like a father to us now." The words sliced through me. I blinked, convinced I had misheard. "Excuse me." My voice was calm. Too calm for the fire that suddenly roared inside my chest. Michael wouldn't look at me. His fingers drummed against his knee, a nervous tic he had since childhood. But I wasn't focused on him anymore. I was focused on the one person who had every reason to intervene. Doris. She sat there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable. Not shocked. Not apologetic. Just neutral. She knew. They all did. My mother shifted slightly, exhaling as if this moment had been inevitable. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't outraged. She was complicit. Peter, my so-called best friend, didn't flinch. His posture remained relaxed as if this entire thing was just another business meeting. He looked comfortable. Too comfortable. Like he belonged there. Like he had been in my seat for a while. The realization struck like a hammer to the chest. This wasn't new. This wasn't spontaneous. This had been planned. I stared at my sons, hoping, begging for one of them to break, to hesitate, to show even a flicker of regret. But Michael was resolute. And Eric, my younger son, though less vocal, didn't look away. He didn't deny it. I took a slow, deliberate breath, pushing down the molten rage bubbling beneath my skin. I had spent years mastering the art of control, negotiating with ruthless men in the courtroom, breaking down opposing arguments with precision. But this wasn't a legal battle. This was war, and I had walked into an ambush. "Peter is more like a father to you," I repeated, my voice disturbingly even. Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah." I didn't look at Peter yet. I wasn't ready to acknowledge him. Not yet. Instead, I turned my attention back to Doris. "Doris," I said, my voice laced with something sharp, something lethal. "Is there anything you'd like to add?" For the first time, her composure cracked. She inhaled sharply, smoothing down the fabric of her dress as if that would erase the weight of her betrayal. She wasn't ready for this conversation. That was my first real victory. "I think it's best if we all." I held up a hand. "No. No generic rehearsed statements. No deflections. Tell me, Doris, when exactly did my role as your husband and their father expire? Was it gradual? Or did you make the decision in a single night while lying in my bed?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. That was my second victory. She hadn't expected resistance. She had thought I would either explode or break. Instead, I was calculating. Cold. Controlled. And then, finally, I turned to Peter. Peter, the man I had once trusted with everything. The man who had been there for the birth of my children. Who had toasted at my wedding. Who had celebrated my victories and grieved my losses. The man I had called a brother. And now, he sat in my house, in my presence, waiting for me to acknowledge that he had won. He was waiting for me to lose control. I smiled. A small, slow, unsettling smile. The kind of smile that made opposing lawyers nervous in the courtroom. Peter's confidence faltered for the first time, and that was my third victory. I exhaled, stepping back, straightening my cuffs like this entire situation was nothing more than an interesting footnote in my evening. The room was suffocating. The walls were closing in, but I wouldn't let them see it. I wouldn't let them have the satisfaction of knowing they had wounded me. Instead, I turned toward the door. "You have something to say?" Peter finally spoke, his voice smooth, controlled, cocky. I paused, tilting my head slightly, letting the moment stretch uncomfortably, letting the tension coil. Then, I chuckled. A low, knowing chuckle. That was my fourth victory. Without another word, I walked out. Because this wasn't the night I lost. No. This was the night I prepared, and by the time they realized what was coming, it would be far too late. I closed the door behind me and stood in the hallway listening. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then a shift. The sound of movement of relieved exhalations. They thought I was gone. That was my confirmation. They had expected an explosion, a confrontation, a desperate plea for answers, but they didn't understand who I was. I walked down the hall, past the framed family photos that suddenly felt like mockery. Lies frozen in time. The smiling faces, the staged happiness, the illusion of loyalty. My wife, my mother, my sons, and Peter. The betrayal wasn't what stunned me the most. No, it was how normal they made it seem. They had decided. Without me, they had moved on. Without me, I entered my study, shutting the door behind me with the same eerie calm I had maintained in the living room. I sat in my chair, leaning back, my hands folding neatly in front of me. And then I exhaled. The rage sat there, waiting. It wanted to be unleashed. It begged for destruction. I could destroy that living room right now. Flip the table. Shatter the glasses. Drag Peter out by his throat and introduce his smug face to the pavement outside. But violence is short-lived. Pain fades. Bruises heal. Revenge should be permanent. And for that, I needed patience. The pieces fall into place. I had ignored the signs. Not because I was blind, but because I had chosen to trust. My mother's influence had always been strong. Too strong. She had chosen Doris for me. Not directly, not explicitly. But she had shaped the narrative, made sure I saw Doris as inevitable. A good wife. A proper woman. Someone who would build a life with me. And she had been right. Doris was all those things. Until she wasn't. Until she decided that being my wife wasn't enough anymore. I leaned forward, my fingers tapping lightly against the desk. Peter. Of all the men in the world, why him? I had considered the possibility of infidelity before. It's an occupational hazard when you're a lawyer. You see too many marriages fall apart, too many betrayals, too many quiet affairs unfolding behind closed doors. I had once convinced myself that if it ever happened to me, I would know. Then I would feel it. But I hadn't. Because it hadn't been a singular betrayal. It had been a transition. A slow, careful replacement. A planned coup. The mistakes they made. They had miscalculated. They thought my silence meant acceptance. They believed I was too old to fight back, too invested to walk away. But the truth? I was already gone. Not in the physical sense, not yet, but emotionally, mentally? I had detached. And once a man stops caring, once he stops believing that anything can be salvaged, he becomes dangerous. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake? They assumed I had nothing left to lose. They thought they had taken everything from me. But they forgot, I was a lawyer. And power isn't about emotions. It's about leverage. And I had leverage. More than they could possibly imagine. The plan forms. I pulled my phone from my pocket, scrolling through my contacts. First, I called my financial advisor. James, I said, my voice steady. Effective immediately, I want all funds in our joint accounts frozen. He hesitated. Sir, are you sure? That includes your wife's access. I know exactly what it includes. Understood. Click. First move made. Then, I dial my lawyer. Stan, I said, my voice even smoother now. I need an expedited divorce filing. Non-negotiable. David. Now Stan. A pause. Then a sigh. I'll have the paperwork ready by morning. Second move made. Then, finally, I called an old friend. Someone who owed me favors. Someone who specialized in ruining people. And with that, the wheels began turning. I sat back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my next steps. They thought they had won. They thought I had walked away, licking my wounds. But I wasn't running. I was preparing. And by the time they realized it, it would be too late. The next morning, the storm hit. Not with thunder, not with lightning, but with silence. It started when Doris went to make her usual online transfer. Some payment for the house, maybe a casual splurge on one of those expensive boutique items she claimed were necessary purchases. But this time, instead of the transaction going through, the screen blinked red. Transaction declined. She frowned, refreshing the page. Still the same message. She tried again, this time on her phone, switching between accounts. Declined. Doris wasn't stupid. She knew something was wrong. That's when she grabbed her coat, slid into her Mercedes, the one I bought for her birthday, and drove to the bank, where reality finally slapped her in the face. The frozen accounts. Mrs. Landon, the bank manager said, shifting uncomfortably behind his desk. Yes, Doris snapped, already irritated. What's the issue? My account says there's a security hold. I need it removed. The manager hesitated. I'm afraid that won't be possible. Doris narrowed her eyes. And why not? He took a breath, clearly wishing he wasn't the one delivering the news. Because your husband issued a freeze on all joint accounts. His lawyer provided the necessary documents. Legally, we cannot grant you access without his authorization. Doris's breath hitched. That's ridiculous. I have access to these accounts. I have for years. Yes, ma'am, the manager said, nodding politely. And now you don't. A slow horror crept into her eyes. The truth settled in, sinking deep. I had cut her off completely. She had never thought I would do it, not after all these years. Not after everything we built. She thought I would break. But instead, I starved them first. The credit cards decline. By the time Doris left the bank, she was calling Peter, her hands shaking. I imagine the conversation was something like this. Peter, he froze everything. What do we do? But Peter had his own problems. Because as she panicked over the bank, I had moved to phase 2, her credit cards. While she was storming into her bank branch, I was shutting down every single line of credit she had access to. By the time she tried to use her platinum card at a cafe on her way home, it was declined. She tried another, declined. Tried the emergency one she kept in her purse, declined. And that was when the fear truly set in. Peter's business crumbles. While Doris was struggling, Peter was stepping into his own personal nightmare. See, Peter had built his business in large part because of me. Not because he was particularly smart. Not because he was a financial genius. No, because I had pulled strings for him. Because I had gotten him clients. Because I had given him access to the right people, the right investors, the right markets. And now? I was pulling the rug out from under him. One by one, his major investors started backing out. First, the construction firm that had funneled work through him for years suddenly canceled all future contracts. Then the biggest supplier for his company sent a polite but firm email. We regret to inform you that due to unforeseen circumstances, we are terminating our partnership effective immediately. Peter didn't know it yet, but his business had hours to live. By lunchtime, 2 more investors had walked away. By dinner, the company's cash flow was suffocating. And by the time he checked his own accounts, they were in the red. I hadn't just cut him off from my life. I had cut off his survival. The house of cards collapses. While Doris and Peter were separately falling apart, my sons, Michael and Eric, were about to have their own rude awakening. Because the truth was, they had never really appreciated the life I provided. Everything they had, from their Ivy League tuition to the luxury cars in their driveways, was because of me. And yet, they had turned on me. They had called Peter their father. They had replaced me in their minds before I had even walked out of that house. So I gave them exactly what they wanted. I let them live without me. The first thing to go, their tuition payments. Michael, who was midway through his master's degree, suddenly got a notice. Your tuition bill is past due. If not paid within 7 days, your enrollment will be suspended. Eric, who had grown used to his carefree lifestyle, found his monthly allowance gone. No warning. No explanation. Just gone. They called their bank, and just like their mother, they were given the same cold answer. Your father has revoked all access to these funds. You no longer have authorization. Panic ensues. By evening, the phone calls began. Doris called. My sons called. Peter called. Even my mother, the woman who raised me, the woman who orchestrated half of this betrayal, called. I didn't answer a single one. Not yet. Not until they had fully realized it. Not until they had felt the loss. Not until they understood with absolute certainty that the man they had dismissed, the man they had replaced, was the only reason they had anything in the first place. By nightfall, I imagine they all sat in that same living room, the same room where they had made their decision. Only this time, the air was different. This time, they weren't the ones in control. They were drowning. And I was watching them sink. Peter sat in his office, sipping his usual overpriced coffee, blissfully unaware that his world was collapsing. For years, Peter had built his business on connections. Not hard work, not intelligence, connections. And those connections, they were mine. From the moment he started his so-called company, he had leaned on my influence, my clients, my investors, my reputation, and I had helped him. I had built him, because at the time, he was my best friend. My brother in all but blood. But now, I was going to unmake him. The first blow, the vanishing investors. The first sign of trouble came in the form of an email. Subject, contract termination. Peter skimmed the message, his forehead creasing. Due to unforeseen financial circumstances, we regret to inform you that our ongoing contract with your firm is terminated effective immediately. His jaw tightened. The sender? One of his biggest investors. The one that kept his cash flow steady. He set the phone down, running a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his bones. This was nothing. A misunderstanding. Something that could be fixed with a phone call. He dialed immediately, forcing a smile when his contact answered. "Hey Chris, just saw the email, what's going on?" A pause. A long one. Then Chris sighed. "Peter, I'm sorry man. I really am. But we can't be involved with you anymore." Peter's fingers tightened around the phone. "What? Why? What's changed since last week?" A beat of silence. Then, the words that made his stomach drop. "David." Everything went cold. "What about him?" Peter forced out. Chris hesitated again, then lowered his voice. "Look, Peter, I don't know what happened between you two, but well, let's just say he's making it clear that doing business with you is a bad move." Peter shot up from his chair, knocking his coffee onto his desk. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "David wouldn't do that. He's not." Chris cut him off. "He's a powerful man, Peter, a respected one. And between you and me, if I had to choose between keeping business with him or keeping business with you," another pause, "I'd pick him every time." Click. The line went dead. The dominoes fall. Peter stood frozen. The phone still pressed against his ear long after the call ended. No, this wasn't possible. David was many things: controlled, strategic, even ruthless in court, but he wasn't the kind of man to destroy someone's life, was he? His phone rang again. Another investor. The message? The same. Then another. And another. By noon, 4 major clients had pulled out. By 3 p.m., his suppliers refused to answer his calls. By 5 p.m., his entire business was gasping for air. And then came the final fatal blow. The licenses revoked. Peter was still reeling when his secretary walked in, her face pale. "Sir," she said hesitantly. We just got a notice from the licensing board." He looked up, his stomach twisting. "What?" She swallowed hard, setting the document on his desk. Slowly, he picked it up and read the first line. "Effective immediately. The following business licenses have been revoked due to legal concerns regarding conflicts of interest and ethical violations." The rest of the words blurred. His business was dead. Officially. Legally. Irrevocably. Peter's realization. He sank back in his chair, his breathing shallow. This wasn't just bad luck. This was a precision strike. A targeted hit, and there was only one person capable of executing something like this: David. His old friend. His brother. The man he had stabbed in the back. And now, Peter was learning the hard way that David didn't just get even. He made sure you never got back up. The desperate call. By the time Peter gathered his thoughts, he had 69 missed calls. Half were from Doris. The other half, investors, employees, clients, all panicking, all trying to figure out what the hell was happening. And through it all, David hadn't answered once. Peter gritted his teeth and dialed again straight to voicemail. The same voicemail message that had played every single time he had tried to call that day. "You've reached David Landon. I'm unavailable. Leave a message." Beep. Peter exhaled sharply, gripping the phone. "David," he started, his voice strained. I don't know what you're doing, but you need to stop." Silence. He swallowed hard. "Look, I know we need to talk. Just call me back, okay? This has gone far enough." Click. Call ended. Message ignored. Peter stared at his phone, his heart pounding. For the first time in his life, he was afraid. Because David wasn't just mad. He wasn't just retaliating. He was erasing Peter from existence. And there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. The house was quiet that evening. Too quiet. Doris sat in the living room, gripping her phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The lamp beside her cast a dim, flickering glow, barely illuminating the worry etched on her face. She had called David again and again. No answer. Not a single response. Her hands trembled as she tried to call Peter next. But even before the first ring, she already knew what was coming. The same voicemail. "The number you are trying to reach is unavailable." Doris exhaled shakily, looking across the room. Michael sat stiffly on the couch, staring at his laptop. But he wasn't typing. His screen was frozen on something, a notification from his university. Eric, on the other hand, was pacing. He was never the one to sit still when things weren't going his way. And right now, nothing was going their way. Doris knew it. Her sons knew it. But no one wanted to say it out loud because that would mean admitting it. Admitting that David had done the impossible. That he had ripped their entire foundation apart. The tuition funds disappear. Michael hadn't spoken in over an hour. Not since he opened his student portal to check on his next tuition payment. Not since he saw the bright red notice at the top of the screen. Urgent tuition payment past due. Immediate payment required to remain enrolled. His stomach had dropped. That couldn't be right. His tuition was always paid in advance. He never even thought about it. But when he checked his financial records, his heart started racing. The money was gone. His father had pulled everything. Michael had always assumed, always believed that his education was something guaranteed. That it would always be there just like his father always had been. Now, he wasn't so sure about either. He thought back to what they had told him just last night. Uncle Peter is more like a father to us now. His stomach twisted. He had chosen wrong. Eric's lifestyle crumbles. Eric was the first one to break the silence. "Mom," he snapped, running a hand through his hair. "I just tried to buy gas, and my card was declined." Again, Doris barely reacted. She just kept staring at her phone, her mind elsewhere. He scoffed, pacing. "I called the bank. Guess what? My account has been drained." He spun around looking at his mother and brother. "Is anyone gonna say it? Dad is cutting us off." Michael clenched his jaw but still said nothing. Doris, however, finally let out a slow breath. "Yes," she admitted, "he is." Eric let out a bitter laugh, throwing his hands up. "Well, that's just great. I mean, really, what did you think was gonna happen? You let Uncle Peter walk all over him, and now we're all screwed." Doris snapped her head toward him. "I didn't let Peter do anything," she hissed. "Your father." She stopped herself, exhaling sharply. "Your father is just retaliating. That's all." Eric scoffed again. "Retaliating? Mom, wake up. Dad is burning everything down." And for the first time that day, Doris believed it. The phone call that changed everything. When the house phone rang, the entire room went still. Doris snatched it up so fast that she nearly dropped it. "David," she breathed. But the voice on the other end wasn't David's. It was her mother, and her tone was sharp. Cold. "Doris," Margaret said, "are you sitting down?" Doris frowned, gripping the phone tighter. "What's wrong?" Margaret exhaled, as if preparing for something heavy. Then she said the words that made Doris's vision blur. "Your father's retirement fund is gone." Doris's mouth went dry. "What?" she whispered. Margaret continued, her voice steady. "I checked this morning. The accounts, the ones David managed for us, they're empty. Every last cent. We're broke, Doris." Doris couldn't breathe. "But that's not possible. David wouldn't." "Oh, wouldn't he?" Margaret's voice sharpened. "Because I think he would. And I think he just did." Doris's mind reeled. Her father, her mother, they had relied on David.